alaikum, or peace and blessings to you all. I'd like to welcome you all to the United Muslims Association of Toledo Ummat's lecture on civil rights and the political process with our special guest, Mr. Shahid Buttar. To begin this evening, I'd like to introduce our Quran reciter for the night. His name is Muhammad Kanan, and he's a 7th grader at the Toledo Islamic Academy here in Toledo.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. O mankind, surely we have created you of a male and a female, and made your tribes and families that you may know each other. Surely the most honorable of you with Allah is the only among you, the most careful of his duty. Surely Allah is knowing and aware.
Thank you so much for that beautiful recitation. It's always a great reminder when we bring these types of religious texts that are reminding us of the basic humanity that we all share. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nasir Rahman, who is the president of Ummat, and to give a couple introductory remarks.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Blessings and greetings to all of you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contribution. And thank you for the encouragement. I have been recently asked by the organization to be the president of Ummat. It was a very, very difficult decision to take, because it's very difficult to fit into the shoes, which I think I can never, into the shoes of our outgoing president, Dr. M.Y. Ahmed. Dr. M.Y. Ahmed has contributed so immensely to this organization. He has been the president for, I think, at least 10 years. And it is really because of his efforts that we are where we are today. I think not acknowledging his services will be a disservice not just to him, but also to anybody who is selflessly involved in volunteerism to build a better community. Please give him a big hand. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Now, Ummat was established in 1996 by a group of people who had vision. And the vision was to uphold the principles, the values of Islam, and to bring the Muslims of this Greater Toledo area together, and to provide them a platform, a social platform and a political platform. We are, alhamdulillah, on the 14th year of our existence. Incidentally, it is the year 1996, that's when I moved to Toledo. I am not trying to say that this movement was made because of me, but it just happened that it was made when I was looking back at the history. And my hope and my utmost effort will be to continue with these goals, to continue with these efforts. And believe me, for this, I require the assistance, the support, the blessings of each one of you. My goal will be to keep the community united, because that's what we stand for, United Muslim Association of Toledo. And I'm looking forward to your support in that regard. Next, what I would like to do is, I'm going to go ahead and introduce to you our new Executive Council. And I'm going to ask them to come here on the stage. You've already seen our Secretary, Linda Amrubis. Give her a big hand. She is great volunteer, working very hard, has been with Umar for several years, and we're very proud to have young people like her in our ranks. Then we also, the next person I want to introduce is Shamsuddin Wahid. He's our treasurer. Please. He belongs to the military staff, and he's also been involved in the organization for several years. Thank you for all what you guys do. And then lastly, the most important person, I call him the wise, not the vice, the wise president, Dr. Azadin Madkour, for his support. Thank you all, thank you so much, and please pray for us as we embark on this journey. Thank you. And without any further delay, I'm going to ask Dr. Madkour to please introduce our speaker so that we can proceed with the program. Thank you. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this great program that we have. And we're lucky to bring to you our speaker at a time like this. Just a little reminder regarding myself. I was in Paris in the 70s, and when you look Arab in Paris, they ask you your papers. They stop you and they say, "Can we get a look at your documents, sir?" And this happens every day, especially when you're taking the subway. So the only time I was stopped in the United States was when I did some jaywalking. I walked across the wrong spot. It was in LA, so I had to pay $5. So the events that we're witnessing lately, in particular what's happening in Arizona, makes this topic up to date. And our speaker that I'm going to present to you is a very strong defender of civil rights. Shahid Buttar is the executive director. He leads the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and the People's Campaign for the Constitution. He also defends the civil liberties and rule of law principles threatened by, you all know, the war on terror. He was previously the director of a program to combat racial and religious profiling by federal authorities. He's associate director of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy and litigator in private practice with a prolific public interest. Buttar has long advocated in defense of the Constitution. He graduated from Stanford Law School in 2003, where he served as executive director of the Stanford Environmental Law Journal and as a Professor Lawrence Lessig's teaching assistant for constitutional law. In addition to his work leading the Bill of Rights Defense Organism, Shahid supports populist constitutionalism as a civil rights lawyer, independent columnist, community organizer, and the last thing, I don't know how to say, hip-hop and electronic MC. He was among the organizers of several grassroots groups around the country, including the Resistance Media Collective, the DC Guerrilla Poetry Insurgency, and the Stanford Spoken Word Collective. But what was surprising to me when I was looking at his biography is the following. He's also a talented musician, and he frequently facilitates the workshop for young people and emerging artists. He has performed around the world for audiences as large as 50,000 and released his debut CD, Get Out of Your Chair, in 2002. So, again, to remind us of what's going on in Arizona, to help us understand better how we should defend our civil rights, we gotta give a strong applause to our brother, Shahid Boutar.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy, and thank you to all of you for being here today on a Sunday. A few other just notes of thanks. I'd like to particularly thank Salman Hashmi for picking me up at the airport this morning, Dr. M.Y. Ahmed for trying to pick me up at the airport, frustrated by my own insistence to make myself breakfast, which caused a missed flight on the East Coast. And in particular, a very sincere word of thanks and appreciation for Sister Julia Shearson, who's here from Cleveland, and it is through her efforts that I became known to the folks here in Toledo. So thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be with you. I thought what I might do over the next half an hour or so is both share a little bit of analysis about issues that include Arizona and profiling and surveillance, torture with impunity, and threats to the rule of law. And then perhaps, especially for the young people here, I see it's a very generationally diverse crowd, which I'm excited about. Maybe I'll try to weave in a little spoken word to present some of the same subject matter in a different vernacular. And I think you'll get a sense of what that means when I get there. So just to start, I hear a lot of frustration these days in both DC and around the country with the state of our nation's politics and how little seems to have changed since the transition in administration. I think a lot of us felt a great deal of hope, encouraged perhaps by the candidate who is now the president. And some of that hope, I think, has been repeatedly, unfortunately, disappointed. If there is any general theme to my remarks that I would invite you to take with you today, it is the notion that while we may have deserved and well-earned frustration with the president and with our nation's politics as a whole, the president, whoever sits in the White House, is not a cause of these issues. They are a symptom, and symptoms persist regardless of who's in office. Ultimately, our nation's politics, if there's a control on the mic, if we could just bring it down a bit, that would be great. Thank you, that's better. If there is frustration with our nation's politics, ultimately that frustration we have to channel inward and to ourselves. It is by virtue of the political culture that we help construct, and it is a function of the political culture that we help construct that limits and governs what our elected representatives can or cannot do. And so I just invite you, if you share my frustration with the president, and I'll be digging into why I am frustrated with the president and a great many other things, I would just invite you to look for ways that you can take action. If there is any problem writ large in our political system, it is that we have an overdose of frustration and not enough action. To the extent there is action visible in our polity, it tends to come from all of the people from whom perhaps we would least invite them. So I would just invite you to think again about how you have agency as a member of our society in some of these issues. So let's just start. I know here in Toledo there have unfortunately been some very first-hand experiences with the war on terror. I'm referring in particular to the Kind Hearts case. Is anybody in the room not familiar with Kind Hearts? I don't want to rehash familiar subject matter. So you're all familiar with material support. Among the things, the many things that the Patriot Act did, and I'll just note, I have some buttons here. If anybody likes buttons that say the Patriot Act, that's so 1984. I'm happy just to hand them out. So if you'd like the Patriot Act, come talk to me. It is in fact so 1984. Among the things that it did was create new government powers to intrude into the privacy of law-abiding Americans. It also created new penalties, and so one of the penalties that the Patriot Act unfortunately expanded was that for material support for terrorism. And in particular, what it did is criminalize even the provision of humanitarian assistance to war-torn areas where the only people servicing them have been found by the State Department and whatever other executive authorities to have some link to militant or violent extremism. And so you've seen some horrendous prosecutions in this arena, not just that violate the central tenets that you have to actually do something wrong before you're prosecuted, but a whole host of procedural protections like due process. Right? The Kind Hearts Charity and others like it, like the Holy Land Foundation, like the Humanitarian Law Project, their assets were frozen without judicial hearings. Their charities were essentially shut down before any opportunity to contest evidence. These are violations of core constitutional rights. The Sixth Amendment, in particular, guarantees rights to trial before an impartial jurist before a jury of one's peers, and we see not just in the prosecution of charities, but also a whole range of other sorts of offenses that have been prosecuted viciously, a wholesale degradation. And I want to invite your focus on this next term, on individualized suspicion. Individualized suspicion is a core constitutional requirement that law enforcement authorities must establish in order to subject people to scrutiny. I was just talking to someone in the audience earlier who drew my attention and wanted me to refer in particular to the recent proposal to adjust the Miranda warnings that the Attorney General has telegraphed his willingness to reconsider. And the way she framed it was insightful. She said, if you capture someone who you know is evil, why not extend the length of time over which you can question them before you provide them notice of your rights? And let's just go back to the premise. How do you know that anybody in particular is evil? That's what trials are supposed to be for. The reason you read people, everyone, at the beginning of their detention of Miranda rights is so that they have notice of the rights that they have under the process that is supposed to then establish who is guilty of what. There's another proposal going around Washington, proposed by Senator Lieberman, that would strip the citizenship of people accused of any offense related to national security, including the material support issues for which 9 parts were shut down. It falls faulty of the same principle. The reliance on accusation as distinct from conviction, the reliance on an executive official saying that someone has done something bad, as opposed to an impartial process to actually parse out fact from fiction, to listen to witnesses, to examine evidence, is deeply problematic. We have trials and we have courts for a reason. They are bedrock. They are fundamental to the rule of law. If we relax the Miranda requirements, if we introduce provisions to strip the citizenship from people who have established it, there could be fewer gross violations of the rule of law. Unfortunately, some of those even worse violations have already happened, and that's in particular what I'll be digging into here this afternoon. Before I get into torture with impunity, surveillance, and profiling with a particular lens on Arizona and what you can do to help stop it, I want to just take a brief digression and play out the kind parts ruling and just to note how another issue in the news you may have heard about really does impact your interests here in Toledo. So I would hope that everyone knows that Justice John Paul Stevens is retiring from the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Stevens is a fascinating figure because he was appointed by a Republican. He claims to be a conservative Republican, and yet he is consistently framed by the media as a liberal member of the Supreme Court. The reason Justice Stevens is framed as a liberal member of the Supreme Court is essentially because the Supreme Court has been taken over by arch-conservatives during the time since he was appointed to the bench. He was appointed to the bench in 1974, and in 2007, in the first year that Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Samuel Alito served on the bench, they were George Bush's 2 Supreme Court appointments. In the first year that they served on the bench, they ruled in a case called Parents Involved, essentially that the protections required for racial equality under the Brown versus Board decision from the 1950s, the particular measure that Brown required, school desegregation, those new justices declared was suddenly unconstitutional. In their first year on the bench, they more or less overruled Brown versus Board. They didn't say that they didn't. They didn't admit that they had, but that was the effect of the ruling. And Justice Stevens, writing in a very forceful dissent, which he read from the bench, an extraordinary thing for a justice to do, he said, and I'm going to mangle the quote, but it was to the effect of, no member of the court that I joined in 1974 would have signed on to this opinion. The court, right, has 9 slots. And he said that in 1974, the now controlling majority opinion, what now 5 justices, arch-conservative justices, have agreed to, in 1974, not a single justice would have accepted. In the one generation since that time, we have seen a slide of the court from being an impartial institution to being an instrument of right-wing politics. And so Justice Stevens, who is a Republican and remains a conservative to this day, is called a liberal only because, relative to the other people who have then staffed the court to his right, he suddenly seems it. In the moment of Justice Stevens' retirement, there is an opportunity for the President to nominate and appoint his successor, and he's nominated Solicitor General Elena Kagan. I have nothing against Solicitor General Kagan. She is clearly a brilliant jurist. There's no question about that. And it is also quite clear that with respect to a great many civil rights issues, she is very friendly to civil rights. She understands the meaning of the Constitution. She is a fan of ensuring its protections and applying them robustly across the board. However, there are a great many unanswered questions about Elena Kagan's deference to executive power. And I just want to note here one framing distinction. We talk a lot in the law about frames. And it's striking how often, if you attend a Supreme Court argument, how often you can walk out of it and have the impression that at no point did any two people actually speak with one another. One side will be talking about one thing, and the other side will get up and they'll talk about the case, but it won't sound like they're even talking about the same case because they frame it in very different terms. And so civil rights is one side of a coin. There is another side of the coin, and that is executive power. If civil rights are the rights that we have against the state, for instance, the right to remain silent, which is at the root in anti-torture protection, right? If you have the right to remain silent, the reason is so that you won't be tortured into making false confessions, which we have obviously thrown on the wayside. Like the right to a trial by jury, which ensures that you won't be jailed on the basis of executive accusation. We've also thrown that freedom to the wayside. The freedoms to speech and association, both of which we have also thrown to the wayside. The freedom of religious free exercise. These are all freedoms that have been wholesale degraded in the last decade by governments under both Democratic and Republican administrations. That's a problem because what it says is that at no point in the political spectrum are we to find a protector for the Constitution. Both parties have bought in to a non-constitutional paradigm. And so in that context, we're a decade into the war on terror, we are a decade into a fast slide, not down a slippery slope, down a constitutional cliff. We have fallen off the edge. And I don't mean to say this is something that's going to happen. This happened a long time ago. We are free falling from a nation that was once quite proud to have introduced the rule of law and democracy to the modern world into one governed essentially by the whim of the executive branch. And so while we might look at some of these questions in the lens of civil rights, I would just invite you, and certainly the members of the U.S. Senate, to evaluate the Supreme Court nomination through the lens of executive power. And that's what I'm going to talk about in detail now through the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to take a quick break here to bust a poem for the young folks just to help explain what we're talking about. And if those of you who are over my age, I'm right 35, can hang on, feel free to come with us. So what we're talking about here is warrantless surveillance. We're talking about government spying. We're talking about telecoms giving agents data that we are all buying. You can ask to see the policies, but they're still lying. When you're on the phone, the NSA hears you crying. We got JTTFs, fusion centers. If our nation was a car, we lost the fender. The Fourth Amendment, now so much ink, lost by a people who follow but don't think. Follow, don't think. Don't think that intelligence collection aims for prevention. To stop crime before it happens is the intention. But they don't mention that we're talking thought crimes, ideas in your head, criminalizing minds. So we won the Cold War, integrated East Germany successfully, but now, intimidated by terror, sacrificed liberty. Before they left D.C., Bush and Cheney turned the FBI into the KGB. There are 800,000 police across the country now monitoring your activities. You can't take photos, you can't take videos, you can't take notes or draw or blow your nose without your face ending up in a government database. Why? Because intelligence collection aims for prevention. To stop crime before it happens is the intention, but they don't mention that we're tracking old ladies, investigate the state, the mission is shady. Authorities across agencies collect information and share it across their agencies, even though the Constitution once protected privacy. Transition to the White House, wait and see, they're still asserting executive secrecy. What'll it be in the Obama years? You can hope all you want, but you should keep the same fears. We are all still getting ground up in the same social gears. Freedom is not free yet, y'all. We owe it in arrears. We face an aggregate, accumulated democracy deficit. And I am very sorry to tell you that once it sticks, that's it. Because intelligence collection aims for prevention. To stop terror before it happens is the intention. But they don't mention that we're talking thought crimes, ideas in your head, criminalizing minds. And we used to have a whole range of constitutional protections to protect thought, right? That's what the First Amendment is about, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom to associate. These are all freedoms that have been degraded in two directions simultaneously. And one will strike nearer to this community's interests, the other one will impact everyone. And they are government spying in the dragnet context, surveillance, and on the opposite side of the same questions, profiling. So let's dig into that. How are they opposite? Individualized suspicion, you'll recall we raised this about maybe 10 minutes ago, is a core constitutional requirement, right? It's embedded in the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, to some extent the First as well. The freedom to associate means that you cannot be held guilty of the acts of the people that you're around. You have to do something wrong for the arm of the state, for the criminal justice system, to affect you, whether in the context of being investigated, detained, arrested, jailed, what have you, right? You have to do something wrong. You can't just be your friends. Until now. Because that's exactly what happened in the Time Parts case. Right? That's what's happening in the case of Fahad Hashmi in New York. Material support erodes the freedom to associate by criminalizing interactions between people in which the person being prosecuted didn't actually do anything wrong. If you give blankets to a war zone, and you go to jail because of it, or if the charity that you run that's distributing medicine gets shut down, I mean, aside from the fact that that actually doesn't help national security interests, and let's just take a quick pause to examine that. In 2005, there was an earthquake in Pakistan. The US military was very, very visible in providing earthquake relief. If you talk to people in Pakistan today, they will say that that was a high watermark of pro-US sentiment. People recognize that the United States was on the ground doing things to help alleviate a humanitarian crisis. Today, in crisis zones where people might not have enough food or water or medicine, and the US military is not deployed, charities could go a long way toward alleviating the humanitarian needs, addressing the problems that in some parts of the world are driving people to violent extremism. However, those charities aren't active on the ground because if they were, the United States government would prosecute. Which is all just to say it's a stupid policy, aside from being constitutionally offensive. But individualized suspicion, both degraded in the context of surveillance, which affects everyone, regardless of what faith you are, regardless of who you hang out with, regardless of who you call or email. If you use email or the telephone, the National Security Agency is monitoring. That's the terrorist surveillance program. The New York Times, not any government agency, it took a newspaper to alert us that the government was spying on us. This was in 2005. That policy, despite being the object of outrage across the political spectrum by liberals and conservatives, despite being ruled unconstitutional by every federal judge who has ever reviewed the program, Congress in 2008, with the support of then Senator Obama, authorized what was previously an illegal executive program to violate with impunity and on a wholesale basis without any individualized suspicion at all the privacy rights of law-abiding Americans. That program remains ongoing. Worse, we don't know how bad it is, nor does Congress. No one anywhere knows because most of the program is in fact entirely secret. This begets a whole other issue when we talk about democracy, democratic transparency, and the ability, this is part of what the freedom of the press in the First Amendment is about, the ability of the people to see what our government is doing, while having some protections from the government knowing what is in the private lives of each of us. That's inherent in democracy, or at least it has been, unfortunately, until very recently. So that's dragnet surveillance, and that's just one example. There are other dragnet surveillance programs. For example, aside from the TSP, you could look at the FBI guidelines as a dragnet surveillance program. In the very, I guess, a month and a half before Bush and Cheney left office, Attorney General Michael Mukasey promulgated a new set of rules governing the FBI, and what it basically did was invite the FBI to re-engage in all of the violations of civil rights that it had made its business in the 60s and 70s. Just a quick show of hands, does the word COINTELPRO mean anything to folks in the audience? If it does, just raise your hand. All right, no, this is good. I'm glad to, and I'm very glad that you guys are on top of it. COINTELPRO stands for the Counterintelligence Program. This is going to sound crazy, but this is documented in 14,000 pages of testimony before the Congress and the Church and Pike committees in the 70s, and even before that, in the 60s. The FBI was a politicized agency. It was not a law enforcement agency. It was used by political powers essentially to, among other things, undermine the civil rights movement. There's a documented history of FBI, not just infiltration of groups as staid and non-controversial as the NAACP, but as far as a blackmail campaign targeting Dr. Martin Luther King. And this was done with government money, with taxpayer money, and this was incendiary when it came out that the FBI had been engaged in the, not just trivial violations of rights, but a systematic campaign to destroy the civil rights movement and other movements, the anti-war movement against Vietnam at the time, the women's rights movement. The FBI was basically an agency of political surveillance. There were a series of reforms that were put in place at the time. The 2008 Mukasey guidelines under Bush and Cheney essentially lifted all those restrictions, and so now the FBI is back in the business that it was then. So these are examples of ways in which everyone's privacy has been invaded. There are other programs, though, that particularly target vulnerable communities, and I don't have to belabor the point in this room, but anyone with brown skin in this country is on the list. I'll just note that there are different wars that some of us are subjected to. So there's the war on immigrants that a lot of Latinos are being targeted in. In Arizona, if you're a U.S. citizen of Latino descent, you must carry your citizenship papers on you at all times or risk deportation. As a citizen, it gets better. If a police officer encountering you and having an interaction with you does not profile you, which is to say, if they don't ask about your immigration status, someone else watching can sue the police officer for not profiling you. That's true. That's what the Arizona law says. It is that ugly. And that's just one of the wars on people of color. In addition to the war on immigrants, we're certainly very familiar with the war on terror. And it's not just kind hearts, and it's not just the material support cases. It's the cases, like the vast majority, in fact, of counterterrorism cases are, in fact, for lying to a federal agent. They have nothing to do with terrorism at all. Like the case of Abdullah Niazi in Los Angeles. Abdullah Niazi in 2007 reports to the LAPD and the FBI that there is someone in the mosque that he attends preaching violent extremism. It turns out that the person in his mosque preaching violent extremism was an FBI informant, an ex-convict paid $100,000 by the FBI to not only go into this mosque and suggest plots, but to bribe people to participate. Abdullah Niazi then faced counterterrorism charges for, when explaining to FBI agents where in the world he had traveled, there was one trip that got left off the list. So the omission, there wasn't even a lie being told. He gave a list. The list omitted one thing. That then was the basis for prosecution of someone who tried to report a security threat that had basically been planted by the FBI. That's what passes for counterterrorism. I'll just give you another example. Siraj Mateen in New York City, 19 years old. He had the mental sophistication of a 10-year-old. He had various developmental challenges. An FBI agent tried to infiltrate the mosque next door and incite a plot. Failing to find anyone to buy into his plots, this FBI agent basically befriended this young man over the course of a year, made himself indispensable, gave him rides home every night, brainwashed him not just about politics, but also the tenets of his faith. And now, Siraj Mateen is serving a 20-year sentence in Terre Haute, Indiana, for supposedly constituting a national security threat. This is a 19-year-old with the mental sophistication of a 10-year-old who ran his family's bookstore. Those are the national security threats addressed by the war on terror, and I don't need to belabor the point in this room. I'll just note, again, that those same issues, the individualized suspicion that profiling undermines, we see it apparent not just in the war on immigrants, but also the war on terror and the war on drugs. Racial profiling has a much longer history than the last decade. It has been going on for centuries. And it's especially relevant, I think, to African American Muslims, who unfortunately now are facing assaults on their freedoms both in the context of the war on drugs and the war on terror, or Latino Muslims, who face it in all three contexts, whether it's the war on drugs, the war on immigrants, or the war on terror. But the point is, whether it's in the context of the assault on Latinos, or African Americans, or Muslims, or Arabs, or South Asians, the legal tools and the problems we confront as individual communities are the same. Profiling whoever the target is offends the same rights, and it relies on the same executive power. Recall when we were talking about Kagan and the Supreme Court opinion, the flip side to civil rights is executive power. Profiling relies on the same extension of executive power that we see apparent not just in one of these contexts, not just the dragnet surveillance, and not just the profiling of Arabs, or not just the profiling of Latinos, or the profiling of African Americans, but all of those contexts together. The same rights used to stop all of that stuff. And because we have degraded the freedom to associate, because we have derogated the freedom to speech, because we have decided that the right to religious free exercise no longer matters, or individualized suspicion, that is what has given rise to all of these different problems. But at roots, the solution to these problems is the same. And it is the Constitution that has gotten our country this far for the last 200 years. Just with a couple more minutes on profiling, just to share a little bit. We talked a bit about Arizona. I wrote a report for my former employer, Muslim Advocates, about a year and a half ago about border profiling. And these are instances of U.S. citizens returning to the United States from legitimate international travel, often business related, not just searched without suspicion, which is a problem, but also interrogated about core constitutionally protected issues. Like, for instance, there was a case of a Northern California corporate lawyer trained at Georgetown University. This is in the middle of the primary campaign. This was, I guess it was late 2007, about a year before the election. And this corporate lawyer is asked by a Customs and Border Patrol official at San Francisco International Airport, what do you think of this guy, Obama? Presumably as a condition of her re-entry into the country of which she's a citizen. It gets better. This corporate lawyer did not take offense. If we are so blind to our own rights that we don't recognize when they are being shredded, we cannot have any hope of recovering. I'll just note briefly, there was a set of bookmarks that I think made its way around earlier on little blue paper. It is the Bill of Rights. I would encourage you, I would implore you, I beg you to read it at some point. Look at the fourth, look at the first, look at the fifth. These are important rights. They are words on paper, and unfortunately now they are worth less than the paper they are printed on. But these were core civilizational victories. People fought and died for these things. Millennia ago, habeas corpus, you hear about habeas corpus in the context of Guantanamo Bay. It's basically the right to, if you are detained by the government, to have a hearing. It literally means it's the requirement that the government produce the body. So it's the prohibition on disappearances, right? It stood for a millennium. It's not like it was around long before the Constitution. This was a core facet of the Magna Carta. We're talking about 13th century Britain. There are not a lot of things in our civilization that last for 800 years. Habeas corpus was one of them. We are standing on the brink of a constitutional disaster. I want to go back to the point about profiling. We were talking about how, in the context of the wars on drugs, immigrants, and terror, that there's basically profiling of different communities. I want to draw out where that profiling comes from and how the sources are different, but then I also want to point out one way in which the sources are the same, and this will point to a particular opportunity for those of you. So, at the federal level, the agencies engaged in each of these different wars are different, right? So, the war on drugs, that's the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. The war on immigrants, that's CBP, Customs and Border Protection, along with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And the war on terror is principally the FBI, as well as the NSA. This is all alphabet soup. And the point is just that there are different agencies engaged in degrading the rights of different populations. But, you might recall in that poem I spit a few minutes ago, there was a reference to how Bush and Cheney had turned the FBI into the KGB, how there are now 800,000 police across the country. So the FBI has 17, give or take, thousand, maybe as many as 18,000 agents around the country. There are 800,000 state and local police, which is to say a lot more than the FBI. 2 orders of magnitude more. Most intelligence collection is not conducted by federal authorities, it's conducted by local authorities. It's conducted by the Mayberry Police Department, right? The Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office. It's conducted at the local level. Same thing to a large extent, at least in Arizona, with respect to immigration enforcement. 287G is a section of the Naturalization Act that basically allows the federal government to contract out federal immigration enforcement to the states, right? It basically gives the state and local police, the same ones that are collecting intelligence, the authority to enforce federal immigration law. Federal immigration law, just a brief digression, is like a parking ticket. It's an administrative code. They're not criminal violations. The whole idea that people are illegal aliens is a construction. That's a framing device, right? We were talking about different frames, civil rights versus executive power. The whole notion that anyone is illegal is a frame. It's not even true. It's like parking illegally. And so the idea, legally, that's the analogy. And so the idea that people are being deported, that families are being destroyed, that entire communities are being terrorized by the local enforcement of essentially federal parking tickets, quite frankly, is insane. Just like intelligence collection, though, is mediated through local and state police, the highway patrols, the police departments, the sheriff's offices, so is immigration enforcement. So is drug enforcement. It might be the DEA that's doing the federal interdiction efforts, but when you look around the country and you see the millions of Americans who rot in jails, most of them are put there by local police, mostly for nonviolent offenses. It's really interesting when you contrast it with another set of behavior for which very politically connected people have never faced any scrutiny at all, and that'll be the subject of the next poem, and then we'll shift gears and talk a little bit about torture and executive impunity. So first you get put in, cuffed so you couldn't budge. They put you in a cell, no lawyer, no judge. It doesn't matter what you did or didn't do if there's a grudge. Any reason anyone might have to give a nudge. Once you're in custody by authorities, you are done. Because agencies presume guilt by association. Confess, or it will be a hellish situation. Our nation once offered the world inspiration. Now our policies encourage human rights violations. They push you off a plane. You can't tell if it's night or day. You don't know where you are. You've never been there anyway. But here, Camp X-Ray, for years, you will stay. Welcome to the terror drone, Gitmo, Bagram. The president changes, but abuses go on. We don't apply the law equally until we jail John Yoo and imprison Jay Bobby. I'll talk in a second about this. Millions of Americans rot in jails, a quarter of the world's prisoners. Males, females, shackled to a gurney while giving birth. If you're lucky, you might escape rape first, violence committed by guards and prison gangs, entire enterprises to smuggle different things. But the one thing you won't find in any jail is justice. The courts, the system, the judges say, trust us, but look close and you'll see different rules. Mass incarceration for most of us fools, but the officials who authorize torture as a tool get paid to make new laws and teach in public schools. Welcome to the terror drone, Gitmo, Bagram. The president changes, but abuses go on. We can't apply the law equally until we jail John Yoo and imprison Judge Biden. They blindfold you, put you on a table strapped down. There's a doctor in the corner, make sure you don't drown. You will breathe only water until they bring you around. The whole world is listening, but no one hears the sound. For several days at a time, they won't let you sleep or even sit or lie down. You must stand on your feet. No one can visit you because there aren't any roads. When you pray, they throw your holy books in the commode. What happens to you, no one anywhere really knows. America wants more war, and it shows. Allegations of abuse unanswered grow and grow, turning hearts and minds internationally into our newest kind of foe. Welcome to the terror drone. Bagram, Gitmo, the president changes, but we already know that we can't apply the law equally until you jail John Yoo and imprison Jay Biden. So John Yoo is a former official in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department. He now is paid $250,000 a year on taxpayer funds to teach at the University of California, Berkeley Law School. Jay Biden was his boss. He now has a lifetime seat on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. It is one step down from the Supreme Court. It's the last court to which people can appeal as a matter of right in the western third of the United States. And an apparent war criminal sits in judgment over potentially law-abiding Americans. So I just want to note this contrast, right? And let's use the war on drugs or immigrants as an example. You can violate a parking ticket and your family can be destroyed. If, let's say, you came across the border and didn't file papers, say 20 years ago, and you settle here in the United States and you work for 20 years and you raise a family and your kids are born here, so your kids are citizens, but you're not. And let's say you're driving through Arizona, you're stopped, the police have to profile you, as they're now legally required to do, having brown skin, they ask about your immigration status, you don't have papers, and so now your kids are in the United States and you're not. Nor can you ever come back. So we're enforcing parking tickets that viciously. But you can commit violations of our species' most fundamental commitments, norms that we fought a world war to establish, sent a Supreme Court justice to prosecute. The Nuremberg principles. Raise a hand if the word Nuremberg means anything to you. All right, so more hands. Just to spell it out for folks for whom it might not be meaningful yet, Nuremberg was the site of the post-World War II war crimes trials, the tribunals that established that committing violations of human rights is a crime regardless of what law said you could do it, regardless of what politician or what official said you had to do what. It didn't matter who told you. The only thing that mattered was that human rights were violated. There was going to be strict liability for human rights abuses, guaranteed by the international community against individual states on behalf of the individual people within them. That was huge. World transformative. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia created the nation-state system. There had been nothing of equal momentousness in 4 centuries. The creation of the international human rights regime after World War II was a big deal. It's gone. And any despot around the world that wants to torture its citizens from now going forward will cite the Bush, Cheney, Obama, Holder precedent. And what they will say is, we have to look forward, not back. They'll say that it's more important that we heal than that we air our nation's dirty laundry. Well, that, much like the material support standard in the context of preventing charities from giving aid abroad, that is also a stupid policy because it invites torture around the world. It's also a stupid policy because if the president meant to do that, which is to say give up the law and allow these criminals to walk among us in order to curry favor from the right wing, that strategy didn't seem to work so well because the right wing hasn't given an inch. He hasn't gained any favor. There's been no conciliation. They've basically taken the threat of prosecution off the table for the most grievous assaults on human rights in 50 years, literally for nothing. And it does open the door to further violations in the future. And then just going back to the original point, I just want to draw out this contrast. If you are politically powerless, or if you're brown, individualized suspicion and all the constitutional protections that people fought and died to establish, they don't mean anything. However, if you're a senior government official and you commit abuses that are heinous, recognized around the world as crimes, you don't even ever get investigated, let alone have a day in court, let alone face now 10 years in some cases of indefinite detention or torture themselves. So we're basically talking about the rule of law having been shredded. And so, and the last thing I'd say about all of that is whether in the context of the dragnet surveillance programs we talked about, right, the secret policies that invade your privacy every day, or the profiling, the undercover infiltration of activist organizations, or the undercover infiltration of mosques that we've seen by the FBI under its new guidelines around the country, or whether we're talking about profiling in the wars on immigrants of Latinos, or profiling in the war on drugs or African Americans. In all of these contexts, what we are talking about is basically executive power aggrandized and the Constitution derogated, which is why the first thing it's important to do is know your rights. The second thing it's important to do is speak your mind. There are a great many ways to be vulnerable today. The First Amendment's freedom of speech, while certainly having been curtailed, it's not gone yet. And it's gone on not just under one president, right, but two. This administration's continuation of its predecessors' abuses entrenches a precedent. It makes it bipartisan. What began as Bush-era offenses is becoming permanently entrenched as a feature of our national politics going forward indefinitely. Now is the time to resist. There will not be a day when somebody stands up and says, we're no longer free. It doesn't work like that. That's not how democracies die. They die by 1,000 cuts. I'll quote Salman Rushdie. It's like a frog being boiled in water. And the water is boiling all around us, but there are opportunities we have as frogs to leave out. And so, as we're talking about profiling and the role of the state and local police in carrying out the domestic intelligence collection mandate, in enforcing federal immigration law, and enforcing the drug war, The role of state and local police is one that we can control because it doesn't happen in Congress. It doesn't get set in DC. It gets set here in Toledo. Your city councils and your state legislatures control what your local police do. So while you can't stop the FBI, and you can't stop ICE, and you can't stop the DEA, you can't stop CBP, the alphabet soup in DC will continue to careen on its insane course. There are things that you can do here that will serve two purposes. One is take those state and local law enforcement agents out of the businesses of profiling and surveillance. And send an important signal not just to Washington, but to everywhere else in the country that says, hey, there are some people here in Ohio who care about their rights. There's a bill that will be introduced in the Hartford City Council, and it's the state capital of Connecticut, which happens to be Joe Lieberman's home state. It'll be introduced next month, and it will basically establish the most rigorous anti-profiling protections that have ever been considered anywhere in the country. There's a bill called the End Racial Profiling Act. It's been introduced for a decade in Congress, but it's never passed. What we basically did is take a version of FERPA, the End Racial Profiling Act, and modify it for a city council. And so we're trying to do in cities and in states what the federal government won't do. I would very briefly point back to our sister in the back, Julia Shearson, who's engaged in organizing a multiracial campaign in Cleveland, just across the state, to do exactly that. You here in Ohio face particular threats, not just because Kind Hearts was here and you see some of the local relevance, but there's legislation at the state level that would essentially follow Arizona. And it's important to raise your voice. If you scream at your television, nobody hears you. If you mutter under your breath, it doesn't have an impact. When you come together, not to quote the title of my own CD, but if you get out of your chair, when you do things, when you get loud, that shifts the conversation. Half the reason to consider these sorts of reforms, half the reasons to get active as a community are to change what the agenda is. This is how the right wing won. Lieberman's proposing the citizenship stripping bill. Boulder's talking about relaxing Miranda. These ideas were crazy 10 years ago. No one would have even thought twice about them. The only reason that they're not being taken seriously is that the agenda has been shifted. For the last 10 years, the right wing has been doing all kinds of crazy things that no one would have ever accepted 20 years ago, or even 11 years ago, or even right up until the morning of September 10th, 2001. None of the Patriot Act? No one would have bought the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act came off the shelf. The right wing had been trying to get those powers for law enforcement for 15 years before 9/11. If we set the agenda, even if we lose the policy fight, we win the broader war to set the tempo and to establish what the conversation will be about. And the conversation, instead of being about national security or those illegals, if the conversation was about civil rights and limits on executive power, checks and balances, the constitutional rights that have gotten our proud country to the point where it is in the world today, if we shift the conversation and change the agenda, in the broader long-term trajectory, we are assured of victory, but we have to get loud and we have to do it in our local communities first. A lot of people have been trying at the national level, and I have to be honest with you, I have the delightful pleasure of now being able to say that under 2 administrations I've been getting my teeth kicked in politically. All of us in DC, we're not winning, we are losing ground by the day. But DC answers to the rest of the country. It's the news cycles coming out of the local city councils that are coming out of the state legislatures. That's what drives the national conversation. And you can't reach Congress, but you can reach your city council. You take 5 people into the office of your city council person, they'll sit down with you. Give us a call. We have a text waiting for you. You can download it off the web and just walk in and say, hey, I want your support on this. We'll give you press lists, organizing support, and the key here is that when you do this work, when you organize around your rights, then you think expansively about other people's rights who are also being degraded, and then reach out to them. There are a lot of things in our world that are handed to us because corporations or the government facilitates them, whether that's the census, whether that's your mortgage form, whether that's the application to go to school, and a lot of that stuff seems very Byzantine. It is not easy to do because you have to fight your way through a process. Organizing is even harder because there are actual forces trying to stop you from doing it. But you have to do it. You'll hear a lot of people talk about civic engagement, everything from volunteering in a soup kitchen to adopting a Boy Scout troop, and that's great. Civic engagement is powerful. Civic leadership is more powerful. And you can do all the civic engagement you want, but if we don't have civic leadership, we will all be locked up in pens in 10 years, mark my words. A lot of us brought, a younger generation to this country from other places. I was part of that younger generation. I was born in England, but raised in Missouri. And as children of parents who crossed the world to find me freedom, I'm Ahmadi, which is a religious sect in Pakistan that is very viciously discriminated against. And so we came to this country seeking religious freedom. That's what my family came here for. Those principles are all at risk today. And actually, let me reframe that. Those principles have all been lost today. The window of opportunity to regain them remains open, largely because this administration hasn't yet served out its term, right? There is a chance under a different administration to change the paradigm. Once a Democratic administration completes its term, without changing the paradigm, without repudiating dragnet surveillance, without seeking executive accountability for torture, without restoring individualized suspicion in the face of profiling, then it becomes an entrenched precedent. It becomes a bipartisan agreement. And we're done. But we have a few years left in this administration. There is a moment of opportunity. The Patriot Act will be up for reauthorization next spring, in February 2011. Now is a chance to start building, to have a voice when that debate comes back up again. Now is the chance for you to defend the rights of whatever generation you brought to this country to be free. Now is the chance for you, members of my generation, to stand up and lead this society of which we are a part. Whether we are African American, Latino American, we are American. And as Americans, we are inheritors of a legacy of individual rights established through the assertive and aggressive protection of individuals. Were it not for individual activism, we wouldn't have anything. We wouldn't have the right to vote, we wouldn't have the weekend, we wouldn't have workers' comp, we wouldn't have, there would be no government programs without activism. Activism is where it starts. If you're frustrated by the war on terror, if you're frustrated by profiling, if you're frustrated by not being able to go into a mosque and know whether or not the new person who just walked in you've never met before is an FBI undercover agent or informant, if you're frustrated by knowing that every email you send could potentially be read by the NSA, if you're frustrated by those things, get out of your chair and take action. There are limitless opportunities to us as organizers to raise our voices and shift the political landscape. That is the moment that we confront today in 2010, and while this is a moment of profound crisis for our country, it is a moment of equal opportunity. I invite you to engage in it. Please let me know how to support you. Thank you so much for bringing me through. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. As a ex-intern, I was in Washington, D.C. last summer. He just brought back nostalgia and memories of D.C. So right now, I'm sure you have a lot of questions that you'd like to ask, and we're going to open this up to question and answer. Well, I'm going to give this mic to the audience, so if you want to just raise your hand, we can start question and answers.
Please don't be bashful either. I really invite you to share your concerns.
My name is Steve Miller. I'm with the local ACLU, and I'd like to invite everybody to please talk to me after this if you're interested at all in being active in the ACLU. American Civil Liberties Union, which in my opinion has been at the forefront of civil liberties and the kinds of things that he has been talking about for the last 45 minutes.
You guys do great work.
I'm sorry?
You guys do great work.
Okay, thank you. It should be noted that one of the things that he said is also happening in the ACLU since the Obama administration has been in administration. A lot of people feel like things have been fixed. They're not fixed. Okay? We still have military commissions. We still have warrants, wiretaps, all the things he said. Guantanamo still isn't closed. So, and we still have security letters being issued. There's still ongoing investigations that are thwarted at every turn because of under the rubric of national security. So, I mean, frankly, on a visceral level, I like the guy, but I mean, there's a lot of work to do. Okay, it really is, and more and more people saying things are okay, but they're not, as he just said. And I make another pitch for folks that want to be after, please see me after this. And one pitch, again, about something you can do. This is in Ohio. At Wright State University, there is a professor, a tenured professor named Larry Wright, who, I'm sorry, not Larry Wright, that's the university, Larry Craig, C-R-A-I-G.
Larry J.
Craig. I'm sorry, Larry James. Oh, I'm sorry, I messed it up.
Larry Craig was the same.
Larry James, J-A-M-E-S. Anyway, he's a tenured professor, and he is a psychologist and was at the forefront of humanizing torture in Guantanamo.
Was he one of the two consultants?
Yes, he was. He even wrote a novel called Fixing Hell. The problem is, hell, you can't fix hell. It's hell. It's inherently broken. Okay, so the point is, he's a tenured professor at the university. He is head of the psychology department, and he's with the APA, or the American Psychological Association, and was complicit in enhancing torture in Guantanamo. So if you're inclined to write a letter, please write a letter to Wright State and say, boot out Larry James. We really don't want torturers teaching our kids, especially tenured professors at Wright State. So,
thank you for that. While there wasn't a particular question, I will just take the liberty to respond in a couple different ways. First, the ACLU, like a number of other organizations, the one I run, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, CARE in Cleveland, there are a number of organizations that are standing by around the country to help you raise your voice. If these issues concern you, reach out to us. We have a litany of training materials. If you don't know where to start, give us a call. That's what we are here for. Is to help you raise your voice and to cultivate a grassroots voice on these issues. So please reach out to us. On this issue about Bush and Obama, you know, it is, I'm just going to take a liberty, I'll give you 90 seconds of my personal narrative of what happened. Obama talks a big game in the campaign, he comes into office. The intelligence chiefs, in fact, in October of 2009, there was a letter from the 5 most recent heads of the CIA to the president. And this is public, and it basically said to the president, if you seek the disclosure of the latest evidence of torture, which had been required by 2 sets of courts, it will undermine the morale of our troops in the field and it will lead to U.S. troop deaths. Another example of a stupid policy, because if you talk to any actual military interrogator, they will tell you that the #1 reason why foreign militants were driven to fight was allegations of torture at Abu Ghraib, at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So, I mean, the way to address that is to be transparent and hold the people responsible accountable, but that would be too easy, and so we're in this other paradigm. When the president, on the first day of his administration, announced that he wanted to close Guantanamo Bay within a year, the response from the right wing was vicious. And the response from our side, the grassroots movement that was responsible for the change in administration, it was quiet. We were nowhere to be found. And so very early on in his administration, the president learned that fighting for the Constitution is a political loser. You get beat up really bad and your friends aren't there to protect you. We all went home after the election, right? We thought we won. We didn't win. That was the beginning. And so now, having retreated, we've basically lost the field. And so the intelligence agencies once again run DC. There isn't any political space. And ultimately, I just want to draw it back to this point about it being on us. This is not an is anybody familiar with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? Right, sister, do you want to take a crack at just articulating it for us so we get what it's about? I don't want to put you on the spot. It's cool. So it's basically a physics principle. It's the notion that you can't know with specificity the location of any particle at any point in time. The implication, however, is that by observing something, any phenomenon, we impact it. There is no such thing as passive observation. We can read online and watch the television and feel like these decisions are all happening outside our reach, but that's a myth. We construct the dynamic the same way that a physicist observing the position of a particular particle impacts by looking for it where it shows up. We are constructors. And so, you know, the same way the ACLU is taking this fight into the States, the same way that Julia and her colleagues are doing this work in Cleveland, the same way that around the country we're mobilizing campaigns, I really encourage you all to get active too. I know there was one question here and then there's a sister in the back. Raise your hands if you have questions.
Well, just you kept saying they, and you said the right wing. So who are the right wing and why they are doing that? They don't mention. I know we know what's going on.
It's difficult to decide who are the right wing, why now, and why they are trying to do that. I know if you read the history, a lot of it there.
I can give you names of individuals, but this is actually, it's a great question you raised. So, examples of the right wing include Dick Cheney, right? But to make it more broad, it's actually quite interesting, both problematic because it's difficult, but in the problematicity, if that's a word, is an opportunity. So, the right wing, you could say, includes all Republicans, but it doesn't, in fact, because a great many Republicans care about privacy. The libertarian strand from which the Republican Party emerged is more concerned about privacy than progressives. I'm a progressive, and so I'm supposed to care about equality, sustainability, right? In some respects, by virtue of the right wing's assault on the Constitution, I have been conscripted into playing defense for the right wing against itself. Right? Liberty is a conservative interest, it's not a progressive interest. Progressives came to worry about equality and sustainability because we could take liberty for granted. Liberty got won in the 19th century. Right? That was supposed to be what that was about. And so now, because core questions, core fundamental commitments have been called into question, there's been an opportunity for conflicts between political forces that haven't had opportunities to align historically. So libertarians, Ron Paul supporters, for instance, are aghast at dragnet surveillance. A lot of them have real problems with torture with impunity. A lot of them are everyday people, just like you and I, and they care about individualized suspicion and privacy too. So there's a huge opportunity to stand shoulder to shoulder with a lot of people who you might have thought were part of the right wing, but are not. I think when I define the right wing, I think of the military-industrial complex and the intelligence-industrial complex. Make no mistake, there is a ton of money in the programs we're talking about. Surveillance doesn't come cheap. And unlike most businesses, it has a defined and predictable and essentially captivated customer base. We, the public, we pay tax dollars that then go to corporations that supply the government with information. Telecom companies do this, Facebook does this, the grocery store that scans your purchases with a card, they do this. There's all kinds of government, private sector collaboration in the intelligence arena. That's money. So the right wing here is basically corporations that care more about their profits than the Constitution. But you'll notice, the only people we're talking about, whether on the left, progressives, or on the right, libertarians, everybody who has thought about this stuff enough to actually have a position is on the same page. You have a lot of moderate inertia, unthinking, knee-jerk deference to institutions. But the antidote to that is raising the issues, inviting people to consider alternative frames, right? When somebody gets on a plane and tries to bomb a plane in Detroit an hour away, and the right wing comes out screaming, we need more surveillance, we need more profiling, it takes those of us with some modicum of sanity to say, well, first of all, any amount of surveillance wouldn't have picked this guy up. In fact, you had the report. His own father called him in. When you lose reports of security threats reported by their own family members, that tells you that there is too much hay in the stack. We don't need more powers to find the needle. We need less hay. We need real credible threats, not a mountain of fake allegations. Right? That's the only way you lose credible threats. Similarly, the call for more profiling, well, until December 2009, Nigerians weren't on the list, so profiling wouldn't have helped either. Right? I mean, and that news cycle came to drive two narratives, neither of which were actually supported by the underlying event. So this reframing opportunity is huge. It takes organized movements to reframe social questions. It takes, for all the students in the room, I'm going to make this real concrete. When you go to college in the fall, sit down with a handful of people who have similar perspectives to you and start a speaker series. There's probably a million groups that are already doing it. Reach out to the press when they come, and you can help shift the conversation. I'm just rambling at this point. Did that help?
Not much.
Not much?
Not much. Because you started, if you speak out, you'll be in trouble. You speak out. So, and the right wing, you cannot tell who is here sitting right wing. Or who is not the right wing.
But it's not about the individuals, right? I mean, you don't have to go after anybody. All you have to do is speak your mind. They're out there. They'll find you. Right? And I'll be clear here, too, that the only way to be safe is to be loud. right? I mean, when you're loud, yes, you're visible, but it also makes it a lot more costly for the establishment to come after you. And I don't think it's so bad yet that the profiling has been overtly on First Amendment grounds. It's not like they're looking for the activists in the gym yet, right? If you look at fascist trajectories, that happens several years down the road. But it will happen if we don't start getting loud now. I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, to speak now or forever hold your peace. It's kind of like that. We have a question in the back and then here in the front.
Thank you for such a wonderful insight that you gave us all. Not that we were not already scared, and I guess we are more scared now. My question is that you're talking about the grass movements, and I guess this is a grass movement, that people who are today attending are here because they are already insightful and they want to do something. What happened to the leaders? It reminds me of the second president of the United States presenting with alien and sedation law, and they were Jeffersons and Monroes who fought it. Federal government's power to be not that power, overrun by the state when Monroe and Jefferson fought that. So where are the Jeffersons and the Monroes in the Congress and the Senate, and where are the Charlie Wilsons of the Congress? How do we find them? Because every grass movement does need a leader like Martin Luther King.
Great question. You know, some other people that are sort of in the same line that you're talking about. You know, Frank Church was the senator who convened a committee that investigated the FBI in the 1970s and found the litany of the FBI abuses. Senator Russ Feingold from Wisconsin is a stalwart hero, a defender of the Constitution who happens to be locked in a re-election race this year to regain a seat in the U.S. Senate. When the Patriot Act was first proposed in 2001, he was the only senator among 100 who voted against it. When it was, pardon? In the House, right. I mean, he was the only senator, right. There are a number of House members voted against it, and to our, you know, collective credit, now there are a lot of other senators who are standing alongside Feingold. Durbin in Illinois, White House in Rhode Island. Franken in Minnesota actually hasn't been as good as I think many of us hoped he would. Sherrod Brown from Ohio has some promise, right? I mean, they exist. They're just marginal. And the difference between now and then is that then most of the inertia, the moderate middle, was with the constitutionalists. Today, we basically let the debate slide so far that we are now the minority as constitutionalists, people who care about individual rights. We are in the minority. But those elected leaders are out there. If there's any, again, going back to where I started, any central thing to leave with you is that don't defer to the leadership, whether allied with us or hostile to us. It's about what we do that shifts not only what they hear, but also who ends up in those seats. If you talk about a political culture where people are mobilized and vigorously raising their voices, and you have a lot of vigils, marches, protests, op-eds, press conferences, letters to the editor, where you have events like this happening all the time, it's a very different climate to run for public office. And you'll see different people getting in office. So at the same, you know, when you ask where are the Frank Churches, where are the Feingolds, that also is on us. We are too busy watching television and not busy enough organizing. You know, there are a lot of distractions in the world today. Sports, fashion, celebrities, like all that stuff matters maybe, but like it doesn't matter as much as whether or not the police have the authority to walk into your house and drag you away for having done nothing wrong. And so, you know, whatever time you spend on sports or fashion or celebrities or video games or television, like just think about it. The next time you hit the power button, how much you might rather be doing something else. Like reaching out, picking up the phone and calling somebody who maybe you think has these same concerns, or going to attend a meeting of a group that you have no connection to and finding out how you can help them, right? That's the meat and potatoes of organizing, is just reaching out and being present in physical, live reality. I think there was a question.
We'll take one more question.
Yes, I'm a member of the American Civil Union since the 50s. I could not hear what you say because of my lack of hearing. I hope that the United Muslim Association leader has recorded this
And so that I'd like to provide a verbatim copy of what you said and what the audience has said, because both to me are brilliant.
I do see a camera in the back, so I think it is being recorded.
We have a question.
This is both a comment of support and a question, I think. I'd like to support your comment about finding allies in unusual groups. I think, for instance, the National Rifle Association has been very focused on supporting our constitutional amendment, the second amendment of the Bill of Rights, around the right to bear arms. And I think if we can take any lessons from their work, it's that grassroots movements are what it's about when it's about protection of our constitutional rights. They've been very effective at getting small groups of people locally to lobby for changes in gun laws that have promoted concealed carry, so that now I think it's the 43 or 48 states have the right to carry concealed weapons with proper licensure and all that.
And they just won that battle in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and that was a local battle. It was not a national battle. It was a local battle to support those constitutional rights. I think you've got a really good point there. And they may be allies for us because of their work in the constitutional arena, because they know how to do that.
Brilliant.
And that's where I don't know where that gentleman went. We was talking about
who are the right people.
Who are the right people. It doesn't matter. It's, who's willing to protect the Constitution.
That's right. And just to go on that a little bit, all politics are local. It doesn't matter what the issue is. If it's climate change, if it's counterterrorism, if it's human rights, if it's economic justice, it's local. Because local is where the action is at. This is where the opinions get molded and they get taken from the local level to the state and to the federal level. I'm going to just quickly take one part of what you said and kind of dig into it a little bit. The reforms that we're pushing, for instance, in Hartford, which we're also pushing in New York City, in Chicago, in Cleveland, in Los Angeles, in Ithaca, New York, in Asheville, North Carolina, in Albany, New York, and then I think there might be another couple. That's most of the states right now where we're active. The limit is basically literally where we find people who want to approach their city councils with a set of reforms. I'm going to talk just very briefly about those reforms. So at the same time that they create robust protections against profiling, they also limit intelligence collection by local authorities. Intelligence collection is not the same as criminal law enforcement. Criminal law enforcement is when you investigate crimes that have happened. Intelligence collection is when you investigate lawful behavior to feed into databases and then somehow supposedly figure out when the next threat's going to happen. It's kind of, it would be funny were it not so offensive. It doesn't actually work if the recent past is any indication, but aside from that, it's very violently offensive to constitutional rights. Intelligence collection deeply offends libertarians. And so by promoting a set of profiling protections that cut across the wars on drugs, immigrants, and terror, not only is it a vehicle for broad collaboration among different communities of color, but because it also has domestic intelligence collection limits built in, it can be a way to attract interest from some of those folks who you might think were in the right wing, the libertarians. When we go one step deeper, people are familiar with the Tea Party, I imagine, right? So the Tea Party includes people with a lot of different perspectives. A lot of them are xenophobic, a lot of them are libertarian. If you have a set of enforceable limits that stop domestic intelligence collection at the same time that they protect communities of color from profiling, that can be a way, essentially, to gain the allegiance of people in the conservative movements, the conservative grassroots movements, because they care about privacy too. And if you have privacy protections alongside profiling protections, the ones who care more about profiling than they do about immigrants, they'll join you. A lot of this outreach is about thoughtfully constructing what you're asking for. And we've certainly done a lot of that work. I know a lot of other people have too. And I just, before I close, I just want to say again, if these issues concern you, if you're scared, get loud. And if you need help, come find me. I'm going to be here for a little bit. We've got the bookmarks that we handed out. Our website is at the bottom. Please visit the site and reach out to us. Me and my colleagues are standing by, and our whole purpose is to support grassroots activism. We've got a bunch of information resources available for you. We can support your local organizing from afar, and I really look forward to seeing what happens here in Toledo coming up. Thanks.
I'd like to give like one more round of applause for our speaker. I know I benefited a lot, and I hope I also wanted to thank all of you for coming out today. You don't know how much it means to all of the people on the board of Ummah to have people that are interested and engaged in these types of events and community events. And I wanted to bring to your attention another event that's going to be happening at the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo on May 23rd at noon. The speaker is going to be Omar Atiyah, and he's a community activist, and the title of the event is going to be Beyond the Institutional Shackles, Why Young Americans Stay Away from the Mosque and other religious institutions, and why you shouldn't blame them. And so it's going to be at ICQT May 23rd at noon, and it's a really important topic, so I encourage all of the youth and all of the parents to come and join us in that. And Ummah and these types of events won't be possible without your interest and your donations. So please, on your way out, if there's anything that you can donate, even if it's your time, your money, anything that you can do to make sure that these types of events keep on happening, please keep us in your hearts and in your wallets. So thank you all for coming, and there's refreshments with tea and coffee in the back. The tea and coffee is finally done, so thank you.